In the late 19th century, just beyond the dusty outskirts of a small Australian settlement, stood the Murphy family farm. It was set far away from other homes, surrounded by dry, cracked land and tall eucalyptus trees that swayed slowly in the wind. The air there always felt still, almost too quiet, as if the place itself was holding its breath. Thomas Murphy, a tall and stern man, lived on the farm with his wife, Eleanor, and their two children, Samuel and Rose. To the people in town, the Murphys were known but not truly understood. They rarely visited, and when they did, their interactions were short and distant. Thomas spoke only when necessary, his voice cold and controlled. Eleanor kept her eyes down, avoiding conversation, while the children stayed close to her side, silent and watchful. At first, nothing about the family seemed truly alarming, just unusual. Many families in the area preferred isolation. But as months passed, small details began to trouble the townspeople. The Murphys stopped coming into town altogether. The children, once enrolled at the local school, suddenly disappeared from attendance without explanation. Then came the nights. Several locals claimed they had seen a faint, flickering light coming from the Murphy house long after midnight. It wasn't the steady glow of a lamp, but something irregular, like shadows moving across the walls. Some dismissed it as imagination, while others felt a growing sense of unease. Despite the whispers, no one dared to approach the farm. It sat there in silence, distant and untouched. Until one afternoon, when a traveling merchant named Arthur Wells was seen heading down the lonely road toward the Murphy property, and was never seen again. The disappearance of Arthur Wells did not cause immediate panic, but it planted the first real seed of fear in the small settlement. Arthur was a familiar face, a traveling merchant who passed through every few weeks, selling tools, fabrics, and small household goods. He was known to be reliable, always returning on time and keeping to his usual routes. So when days passed without any sign of him, people began to worry. The last confirmed sighting of Arthur came from a farmer who had seen him traveling down the long, empty road leading toward the Murphy property. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Travelers often stopped at isolated farms for water, food, or a place to rest. But as more time passed and Arthur failed to appear in the next town, concern quickly turned into suspicion. A small group of men from the settlement decided to investigate. Armed with little more than concern and curiosity, they followed the dusty track toward the Murphy farm. The journey itself felt unsettling. The further they walked, the quieter it became. No birds, no distant sounds of livestock, just the soft crunch of dirt beneath their boots. When they finally arrived, Thomas Murphy was already standing outside, as if he had been expecting them. He greeted them calmly, his expression unreadable. When asked about Arthur Wells, Thomas claimed the merchant had stopped by briefly, shared a drink of water, and then continued on his way before sunset. His tone was steady, almost too steady, and his answers came quickly, as though rehearsed. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the situation didn't feel right. As they looked around, one of them noticed a patch of earth behind the barn. The soil appeared darker, freshly turned, and slightly uneven compared to the surrounding ground. When questioned, Thomas dismissed it without hesitation, explaining he had been digging a pit for waste disposal. There was no clear evidence to challenge his claim, no visible belongings of Arthur, no signs of struggle. With no proof and growing discomfort, the group eventually left the property. But the feeling stayed with them. Days later, the tension in the town deepened when another person vanished, a young woman traveling alone along the same route. This time, fear spread quickly. 2 disappearances, both linked to the same lonely road, could no longer be ignored. The Murphy farm, once just a distant curiosity, had now become the center of something far more troubling. As fear tightened its grip at the settlement, local authorities could no longer ignore the growing pattern. 2 people had vanished without a trace, both last seen near the same isolated stretch of road. This time, the investigation would not rely on guesswork. A small team of officers arrived at the Murphy farm early one morning. The air was tense, and even the usual silence of the land felt heavier than before. Thomas Murphy stood outside once again, calm and composed, but his stillness now seemed unnatural, almost rehearsed. The officers wasted no time. They began with the house. At first glance, everything appeared ordinary. Simple furniture, neatly arranged, no immediate signs of disturbance. But as they searched more carefully, unsettling details began to emerge. There were marks on the wooden floor, dark stains that had been scrubbed repeatedly but never fully disappeared. Some doors inside the house were locked. When asked to open them, Thomas hesitated, then claimed they were used for storage. The hesitation was enough. The officers forced the doors open. Inside, they found very little, just empty spaces, old tools, and a strange, lingering smell that no one could quite explain. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to make them uneasy. Then they moved outside. Behind the barn, the same patch of disturbed soil caught their attention again. This time, there would be no dismissal. The officers ordered it to be dug up immediately. With each shovelful of dirt, the tension grew. Minutes passed in silence until suddenly something was struck beneath the surface. What emerged next turned suspicion into horror. Human remains, poorly buried, partially decomposed, and unmistakably real. The discovery froze everyone in place. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was something far darker. Thomas and Eleanor were taken into custody on the spot, but as the officers stood there, staring at the ground, one question lingered in every mind. How many more were hidden beneath the surface? Once in custody, Thomas and Eleanor Murphy were separated and questioned for hours. The investigators expected resistance, but what they did not expect was silence. Thomas refused to answer even the simplest questions. He sat still, his face empty, offering nothing that could explain the horrors discovered on his land. Eleanor was different. At first, she tried to defend her husband, repeating the same claims that they had done nothing wrong, that there must be some mistake. But as the hours passed, her composure began to crack. Fear replaced denial. Her voice trembled, her hands shook, and eventually she broke. Through quiet sobs, Eleanor began to reveal the truth. Years earlier, the Murphy family had been pushed to the edge of survival. A brutal drought had destroyed their crops, leaving them isolated and desperate. Food became scarce, and hope slowly faded. Then one night, a stranger arrived at their door, asking for shelter. Thomas saw something else, an opportunity. Eleanor admitted that what happened next was not planned, but once it happened, everything changed. The family crossed a line they could never return from. What began as a single act of desperation soon turned into a pattern. Travelers passing along the lonely road were invited in with false kindness and never allowed to leave. Their belongings were taken,
Their bodies were buried behind the barn. But the most disturbing revelation was about the children. Samuel and Rose had not been protected from the truth. They had been raised in it. Eleanor confessed that they knew everything. Over time, they had come to accept it as normal. Samuel, in particular, had begun assisting his father, following his instructions without question. The Murphy farm was no longer just a place of survival. It had become a place where something deeply unnatural had taken root and grown unchecked for years.
The arrest of the Murphy family sent shockwaves far beyond the small settlement. News of the case spread quickly across late 19th century Australia, drawing intense public attention. Newspapers filled their pages with grim details, describing the isolated farm, the buried remains, and the chilling confessions that had begun to surface. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. People traveled from distant towns just to witness the proceedings. There was a sense that this was not just a trial, it was something that would be remembered for generations. Thomas Murphy remained as he had been since his arrest, cold, silent, and unreadable. He showed no reaction to the accusations, no fear of the consequences. Even as witnesses spoke and evidence was presented, he sat still, as if detached from everything around him. Eleanor, however, told a very different story. With a trembling voice, she recounted the years of hardship, fear, and the gradual descent into violence. She did not deny what had happened. Instead, she described it as something that had taken control of their lives, something that began with desperation but grew into something far darker. Her testimony shocked the courtroom, especially when she spoke about the children. The fate of Samuel and Rose became one of the most debated aspects of the trial. Were they victims of their environment or willing participants in the crimes? The court struggled to decide. In the end, the verdict was delivered. Thomas Murphy was sentenced to death, his punishment reflecting the severity of his crimes. Eleanor received a lengthy prison sentence, her cooperation considered, but not enough to free her from responsibility. The children were removed from the public eye, placed under strict supervision, their futures left uncertain. The Murphy farm was abandoned soon after. Over time, it fell into ruin, slowly reclaimed by nature. But the memory of what happened there never truly disappeared. Even years later, people spoke of the place in hushed tones, because some stories are too dark to ever be forgotten. If this story kept you on edge and made you question what really hides behind closed doors, then don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because some of the darkest stories in history are still waiting to be uncovered, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the children were victims or something more? And remember, this was just one case. There are many more chilling stories coming soon.